Hi guys, my name is Paul Czech. I'm a front-end developer here at 10 Pound Gorilla. And so today, rather than give a normal presentation with slide deck, I was just hoping to open up a conversation about some of the proposed updates to the too sexy section of our boilerplate. And so to start, I just wanted to kind of give you an A-B comparison to show you what's changed. And then maybe we could discuss the pros and cons and talk about ways to improve it. So here in Bitbucket, I created a branch for the updates, but here we is our normal too sexy content directory. In the boilerplate, we have our helpers and partials and our views here at the root level of content. And they're referencing files within the partials and also the helpers. So for the proposed updates, we were thinking that we create these 4 folders here. We have our assets, a dist, shared directory, and a views. And the main idea here is to kind of get all of the too sexy styling and JavaScript and all of the too sexy related files removed from the theme directory and into the content directory in portal 0 too sexy content, or if it's an app, within the app directory there. So within the assets, within the assets folder, we have CSS, fonts. This may or may not be necessary. Images, where we add our background images or anything that we need for the too sexy component, and then our JavaScript. And then I'll dive into what we have in the CSS folder here in a second. And then we have a dist folder where we would compile all of our styling into the file just maybe called style.min.css, and it'd be minified. And we need to research the best way to compile that, whether it's through gulp or webpack or any other method. And the same thing for the JavaScript. And then we would reference this file within the views section, all of the views. And then I'll show you that as well. And then we have our shared folder, which we kind of just moved our helpers and partials into a shared directory. Yeah, it's various partials and helpers. And then our views, rather than having them at the root level here, we kind of try to create categories, directories, banners, or lists. And then within each one of those files, we would reference that style sheet or that JavaScript file as necessary. And I was talking with Dustin yesterday and Chris, and so like I was wondering if we were including this file in every component or every view file, I thought it might be redundant to you would have that same CSS on the page multiple times. And but I believe having this data enable optimizations attribute set and adding the type attribute with the text CSS value will too sexy will see that and only show it one time, I believe. So if we go back to our assets directory and look at the CSS, at the root of the CSS, we'd have a file called styles or something like that. And in that folder, we would pull in everything that, the variables folder, anything necessary from the theme. And there may be a better way to do this than using the relative paths. But we're referencing the file from our skin folder. And so we can use our variables and anything mixins, anything else like that. And then in the Sass folder, we would, if there was a speed bump component, we would just create a Sass file like that. And we import that style, so we'd have the variables and then any other necessary libraries. So speed bump would use a modal, and maybe other components wouldn't need that. And so we import the modal library here, and then any necessary styles. And then again, like as I mentioned, we would compile everything into that dist directory here and then reference it within the views. So those are just some proposed updates, working with Chris and Dustin and what they suggested. And so maybe we could talk about what you guys think about pros. Give me some pros and cons, or what you think about doing something like this. Do you believe you feel it's necessary to remove the two-sexy component styling from the skin folder?
So I just had a question. You
Sure.
you showed that file that you were importing the modal styles, and that was for the specific component, right?
Yes.
So if you had two components on the same page that both use the Bootstrap modal, would you be loading the modal CSS twice?
No. So one thing that I found out actually yesterday, which I didn't know before, was that when he showed you that text, like the link type text/CSS, that is what I was missing in my files for NCSL project. That alone, in combo with the data enable optimization, that data enable optimization is checking to see if that that style sheet's been loaded yet, and if it has, then it basically says I don't need to load it again. So if this style sheet appeared 5 times in different CSHTML Razor views or whatever, and they're all on the same page, it's only going to load it one time. Before, I thought you had to enable compression in order for that to only load one time, because it only, when DNN's compression is turned on, it does do that. But found out yesterday that type equals text/CSS is the part that was missing in order for what it should have been doing from the get-go, which is checking to see if it even needs to load the CSS via that data enable optimization.
But I guess what Gabe's asking is, when we compile it, if it's included twice, like in this component, I'm sorry, guys. Is it going to be, is this going to, like, say we had another component that used this, is that modal CSS going to be included twice within the main unified CSS? I think, is that what you're asking?
That's what I meant, because this is using, this is a SAS file. So what that's doing is pulling in the contents of the modal styles. But if multiple parts that are being kind of concatenated together are all doing that, would it not?
If you were feeding that into like the same style sheet, then yes. So you wouldn't want to like include that modal and then include it again in a different file. Like
so we want to include it at the styles level. Then anything we needed would be, so we would just include the modal out here, essentially, whether we used it or not.
Yeah, because the styles SAS file is being referenced within your speed bump component, and so it pulls all of it together to build one file at the end. And so, go ahead.
Well, yeah, it's going to only potentially be a problem is if you have components that would like reuse something. So like if you reuse the modal in another view and you pulled it in, then that's when it's duplicating the CSS in that compilation.
Well, we were talking yesterday about like the example on NCSL where specific component SAS files pulled in more than just what the main library was here when they pulled in. You said there was a reason to do that within, if you remember. Maybe I could go back.
Well, we're using that so that you can write SAS. So like the variables and the mixins and the utilities, those are just utilities so that when you write your SAS, you can use those utilities. Like I can use the colors primary or secondary and render those. The additional like Sass files, like the modal, you're actually bringing in like and compiling CSS that does get compiled into that styles, the final file. So if you had that modal in multiple views and you're calling that in, then that CSS just gets repeated multiple times, is what Gabe's saying.
Right.
Now, there'd be occasions that maybe that would occur, but probably a lot of our components, like, I'm trying to think, like, what is whatever the carousel uses, Bootstrap carousel, you're probably not going to have a lot of components that use that. And I think if you do have a shared Sass component that you need to use, then you need to make that like a shared file and then bring that in. But yeah, it's something to think about. I guess I'm not really explaining it very well, but I understand what Gabe's saying, is that it could get duplicated if you had multiple views using the same Bootstrap. Where like the mixins and utilities, they're not creating classes. So if you look at the outputted style, it's not really creating anything. You're just using some utilities to build your Sass.
Yeah, things like mixins and variables shouldn't really matter because it doesn't result in direct output.
Right. So it's really like that final thing, like the modal. If you end up using that in multiple views, then yeah, we would have, and then you compile it all into one CSS file. Then you do. So you'd have repeated code, but that then comes back into that organization of that me and you, Paul, talked about yesterday, is like how we need to start thinking about breaking out our views into multiple apps rather than just all into one single app. And I think that's probably something that we could all discuss, because I don't really know myself, because I've thought about it, like what components are we building that really need its own app? Or do we just need to group our apps in a way that organizes them better so that they're not all in one app, that then we can leverage? So each app would have like its own style sheet, master style sheet, but then you reduce the amount of views that are in each app so that you're not having so much overlap and duplicate, or just so many, views in one app.
Multiple apps would probably also be better from a content manager perspective, because especially on a site with a lot of different views, it's very hard to organize those in a way that you can easily find them.
Yeah, I agree. So the Sass compiling thing, I think that may not be a problem. I mean, in some rare occasions, you might want to reference something, and then you'll have to figure out how you want to share that and compile that to a CSS file. But for the most part, you're probably not going to be bringing in duplicate Bootstrap. I'm not going to bring in the nav and the modal, and then bring in the nav on another one and on another one. Maybe it's that nav becomes a shared file or something. But I think that those cases that I think, Gabe, that you're talking about are going to be rare, although definitely can happen.
I also think when we're building components, if we say we didn't include the modal in our theme or our skin, and we're now building a component and we need it, the process would be to enable it for your theme. And then using your TwoSexy component code is where you'd go in and potentially put modifications to it if and when it's needed. Because, I mean, the website's built on Bootstrap. It's something that just including it in part of that TwoSexy component because you need it then might not be all that beneficial. I mean, instead of just having it in your theme to begin with. I don't know if I'm rambling or making any sense at all.
No, I think it does make sense, Chris, because if it was something that we were using a lot in multiple views, then that might make sense that we have that turned on in the theme, and then you don't need to.
I think that's a good idea from a long-term management and maintenance perspective too, because if someone is going into a skin that they didn't initially build and need to add a carousel to something, then going back to the main skin and making sure it's enabled there might be a good idea, just because it might be somewhere else that they didn't know about, and then kind of just helps prevent case like that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, Dustin, you made a point when we were talking yesterday that was something on the opposite side to think about, is that if you built a Too Sexy app and you wanted to make it so that you can export that and install it on any DNN website, and regardless if it's using Bootstrap or Tailwind or something completely custom, by including it in your Too Sexy app and building it part of that CSS, that then allows you to take that code and ship it with anything. But I don't know how realistic that is. You probably are still going to have other problems because there's other Bootstrap classes that are going to be probably missing. There's JavaScript that's going to be required to allow that modal to even do what it's supposed to do. So a modal net might not be the best example of something like an accordion. Maybe there's still JavaScript related to an accordion. So let's say the card component, right? If you don't normally have cards enabled in your theme, but you're building a Too Sexy component where it's needed, just putting it in that app only calls that CSS when you need it. But then I'm just being in a full circle. I'm sorry, guys. But I think for other developers to understand, where do I go look to find a Bootstrap card? You're going to say that is, we're using the Bootstrap framework. That's part of our theme. That's where I'm going to go check. And that would be probably your first place to go and like make sure it's enabled and building and all of that. So I'll stop rambling.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that like with anything, there's gonna be some catches where like, oh, this isn't perfect, but really, it just goes back to like most of the content probably, and a lot of the CSS can stay in the theme, but like for that homepage where you're only using that hero banner on just that page, we don't need to have that CSS and JavaScript and anything else part of the theme if it's only going to be on that home page. So it's probably more like this is more important for apps or content that isn't commonly used on multiple pages. So and I think that's why that content app was developed, as opposed to like the main app was like, okay, basic content that's on all pages, let's just make it the content app, and then create apps for stuff that isn't on like every page of your site that's more heavier with JavaScript and other stuff. So
yeah, the NCSL map app and the charts app, those are like good examples why we want to compartmentalize the CSS and JavaScript, because there are 1% of the pages that they have in their site where that's being used. So for all of those other pages, we can reduce the overhead, the amount of code that's loading, because it's used so rarely. So I think like that's a good use case.
Well, and like a lot of times we don't need Bootstrap the JavaScript file, right? Unless there's something you're using in it for the theme, but like maybe the nav, but most of the time we don't need that being loaded, I don't think, unless you're, depending on what content's on the site. So like that's something too that could get loaded on a per view standpoint. Like check to see if Bootstrap's already been loaded on the page. Too Sexy's able to do this with what they call turn on, and then it checks to see if Bootstrap JavaScript's already loaded, and then it won't load it. Or if it's not loaded and it says, well, this app needs it, then it'll load it. And that's sort of what we're trying to do with the JavaScript and the CSS, is when possible, or if it makes sense, to only load stuff when necessary.
I think if you look at how a lot of modules are being developed, when they look at how they approach CSS, you can see the problems and the difficult things that we are struggling with right now and trying to solve for is the same problems they have, like live forms and action form. They put in their own CSS, they ship with their own version of Bootstrap because they need to control how it looks and displays from like their admin side, or even the like the form that gets rendered. And so sometimes that conflicts with your theme, and it's something that we just have to work through because they need to maintain the integrity of the app that they're building, and we would have the same thing here with Too Sexy. So if I understand it correctly, Paul, this is the styles.scss file within the Too Sexy content directory. And so if we were to go in to compile this and we wanted to include the speed bump sash sheet that you included, we would put that at the bottom of it, just like we do when we build out our theme and all of the other files that we include. And we would compile that styles.scss into our styles.css. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I don't think, yeah, I forgot to add it there actually.
And so that would build to that distribution folder.
Yes. Yeah, and I don't know the best way. I didn't look into how we could actually, what we would use to compile it, what process we would use.
Mm-hmm.
But Gulp or Webpack would be able to create minified versions and compile everything. So that might be the next step to look into.
I was curious about something. So for the component-specific CSS, on the back end, is it compiling all of those for what's needed and just loading that as like one file?
From what we talked about yesterday, it's all going to be in the style.min, all of it. Okay. Which isn't really different than what we do with our skin. So I don't think the from what we were talking about yesterday, the goal isn't really to save on overhead, but I guess more of an organizational structure.
Yes, that's correct. So the idea is that you would have one CSS file that gets generated for your Too Sexy content pieces, and then if you create an app, like a map app in Too Sexy, then you would have a CSS file dedicated for that map app, and then you would have your theme. So in general, 2 or 3 plus how many ever apps you have would have their own CSS file. This is different than how Dustin had implemented the NCSL CSS, because he created a dedicated CSS for each view file that was essentially getting created. And after some review, he was kind of saying that keeping it one file per app or content is probably more efficient, easier to maintain and whatnot.
Well, and I think just like we do within the theme, you can have all those CSS files, but we might just compile them all down into one, like we do into the skin.css file. So you could break out each view. You could have your own CSS files, but we might, say, well, we don't want to have all these individual CSS files for the distribution of our project. For the distribution, we want to compile them all into one. So it doesn't mean you can't have the multiple CSS files. It's just maybe we compile them into one so that, we're not trying to load it so individually per view, more like load it individual CSS file per app. But then we just have to get better at thinking about how we break out our views into separate apps when it makes sense. Which I still struggle with. Like, I feel like I keep putting everything in the content app when I'm working on projects going, geez, should I have broken this out more? Does it make sense to break it out more? Even if it's content that seems like is fairly common. I don't know what you guys think as far as that, because I think we've all put it in one app. And like when we talk about lists and banners and accordions and tabs and all that, should those all be in one app, or should we be breaking out? Accordions is its own app, tabs is its own app, carousels its own app, basic content with just text images is its own app, but those don't do anything. Like there's no navigation, there's no toggles, there's nothing. It's very basic. How do we group our content into apps better? I just like your guys' thoughts and opinions on that. If anybody has any.
I guess I'm just really curious on like the efficiency standpoint for development. How much time does it take to create different apps versus putting things into content? So if we were to say, like a banner app makes sense. You have your content, which might be an accordion, it might be an image and text type component. If you started with building your content, let's say the image and text, and then you said, okay, my next thing I need to do is to build my banners. How much more time are we talking about to put it into its own app, build out the scaffolding, build out the compilation of your CSS and JavaScript and all of that into its own dedicated app versus just putting it into your content type? So time to build and manage is something I'm curious on for doing that. And then also like the end user experience, like is the user getting a better editing process to go in and select what type of content that they want to use? Is it easier for them to know, like, how do I add a banner to a page, you know? So that's something would be good to understand. And I think those answers kind of come down to the budget the client has. If they have a really large site, they have a bigger budget, so it makes sense to break those out and make it easier for them to manage. Smaller sites, chuck it all in one place.
I'm Gabriel, front-end developer at 10-Pound Gorilla, and I am doing a follow-up for Paul's presentation where it has to do with the separation of CSS for two sexy views. So basically, I have 3 different views that have been configured to tell me whether the CSS for them has been loaded or not. And we can look at these different pages. So this includes none of the CSS. It's just like an indicator for all 3. And see, we on view 1, we have view 1 that loads the view 1 CSS. That hard refresh. For CSS images. We can find the view1.css here, as well as the styles.min.css, which is the overall app styles, which I have pulling into every view. So then we go to view 2, and it's kind of the same thing, where view 2 has been loaded, but the other ones have not. View 3, same thing. And if we go to all views, we can see if we go to the template for this. So each of these takes the main styles.min.css file, but it's only being loaded once because of this. However, we can see if we add a module here, I added one with no optimization that just entirely removes all of that, and it imports everything without any optimization. So if we go choose this, you can see this one has no optimization, hard refresh, and then we can see we have views 1 to 3 twice because this tag or this attribute helps prevent things from loading twice that don't actually need to. But if you don't include it, it will be happy to just load everything several times.
So don't forget that tag and avoid extra CSS or duplicate CSS. Yeah.
It's also worth noting that the CSS files for each individual view do seem to cache, which is good, because that means if you have a specific view on several different pages, I don't have to reload that specific file every time.
Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our Gorilla Learning Lab. We have a lot more banana tidbits for you to get ape over. Check out our other videos or visit our website at www.10poundgorilla.com. I'm swinging on out of here.
Ooh, ooh, ah, ah. Ooh, ooh, ooh. You're not subscribed? That's bananas.